Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I have to say that after 4 very long, demanding days, I'm impressed by your fortitude, especially after the last 2 sessions of uplifting cultural discoveries, I think, for us all. I'm afraid I'm going to bring the discussion back down to earth, back down to politics, I'm afraid. I, as you've heard from Mark, served for a long time as a British diplomat, British ambassador. I spent a lot of time on human rights issues, including helping set up the International Criminal Court, including the Helsinki process in Europe at the very beginning of my career, including dealing a lot with Russia. And let me tell you, dealing with Russia is not an easy challenge for any of us. One of my favorite definitions of a diplomat is a person who thinks twice before saying nothing. So I rather hope to reassure you, at the very least in the course of this discussion, that I'm not anymore, being retired now, that sort of diplomat. And of course our subject, I congratulate also the ICD on their choice of subject for this conference. Human rights has become absolutely central to the sort of business the world and the world's governments do among themselves. And that's actually, I mean, we take it for granted. We watch our televisions. We watch what's going on, for example, in Syria at the moment. And we think, how could we ever have lived in a world where this sort of thing, ghastly though it is, and continuing today though it is, simply wasn't the business that governments discussed. And I'm going to take you a little bit through how we've gotten to the present level of political attention to human rights, and then a couple of observations on where I think we now are and where we might be going. I'm going to go back a long, long way to start with. I'm going to go back 350 years, actually, to the end of the 30 Years' War here in Europe, which was a war that was fought for all sorts of, on the whole, not very persuasive reasons. But one of the key things that it was fought about was the ability of some powers in then Europe to impose their religion on other powers. And the consequence of that determination to interfere in each other's internal affairs was a truly appalling war which killed about 1/3 of the population of this part of northern Germany, actually. Proportionately, it was the worst war that Europe has ever seen. And one rather clear lesson that governments drew as a result of that war in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, was that we should preclude that. States should deal with each other purely on the basis of the sort of political relations they have, the sort of power relations they have, and should not interfere in each other's internal affairs. And that view of how politics ought to be conducted, which of course excludes human rights considerations from what states argue with each other about, ran through for a long, long, long time. And it has to be said, was relatively successful in the sense that we have never since, even with the appalling conflagrations of the 20th century, we have never since had a war as destructive as the 30 Years' War. And don't get me wrong, therefore, this dichotomy between international security on the one hand, states respecting each other's internal arrangements while maintaining security relations with each other, and the world we now live much more in, where states worry again about internal events in each other's, this dichotomy does not mean there is good and bad. Just because human rights and international security are to some extent in tension, you should not judge concerns for international security as being bad and negligible. There are no more important human rights for ordinary people than the right to peace and security in the way they live. Indeed, you could argue that all the other rights we worry about, the right to vote, the right to express your opinion, all of that, become relatively unimportant if you're living in a situation of chaos and destruction. And simply look at the citizens of Syria, citizens of Libya today, and ask yourself that question, and I think the answer is pretty clear. Anyway, we got through, therefore, for a long, long time, and the situation where the international system was exclusively concerned with security actually runs right up, in some sense, to the UN Charter, which is the governing body, the governing document for today's international system, Article 2.7 of which says, "Nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the UN to intervene in matters which are essentially in the domestic jurisdiction of any state." So that exclusion of interfering in internal affairs runs right up to modern times. Now, there have been attempts to change it, and there have been variations on it as a result of domestic politics in one or two places. And I would mention, obviously, as we come to the 19th century, so already 200 years after the 30 Years' War, democracy, great invention, produced by the Greeks, disappears for a long while, reappears in Renaissance Italy, disappears again, begins to reappear again in European systems of governance, most notably, I have to say, in my own country, the United Kingdom. And if you're running a democratic system, you have to take, obviously, the views of your people into account. And people care about other people. So in the UK, and the UK was the dominant world empire by the time we're approaching the end of the 19th century, we conducted our external affairs on the basis of balance of power, balancing this power against that power. And in particular, we were maintaining a very weak Turkey against a fast-rising and threatening Russia. And therefore, when there was a squabble in the Balkans, we backed the Turks. Until, in 1877, there was a squabble in the Balkans, and the local Turkish administration, in the way that they regularly did, massacred the local population. The British government set out, as usual, because they saw an opportunity for Russian interference, to back the Turks, to say, well, it's horrible, but, you know, they're our friends. But it all went wrong, because there was an eruption among the British people. They had a political leader in the form of Gladstone, who was our opposition leader at the time, who produced a fantastic pamphlet about the so-called Bulgarian horrors. And the British government, up until that time, having played the power game, found itself forced to switch sides, to forget its power concerns, and to attend to the massacre. And as you look through the rise of human rights in European historical concern, that's perhaps the first moment. It was a direct product of democracy. And it then runs on forward, and it turns into quite big institutional attempts to incorporate human rights in the way we work. The Vienna Conventions emerged at the end of that century. The International Red Cross was created and protected internationally. And a big moment was, of course, the end of the First World War, which had been a catastrophic demonstration of the breakdown of power relations among European states. Woodrow Wilson came from across the Atlantic with his 14 points, one of which was the creation of the League of Nations, not directly about human rights, with quite a lot of concern for human rights built into its structure and constitution. Lots of very attractive precedents there. It was created at exactly the wrong time and in exactly the wrong circumstances, sadly, 1919 and thereafter. Rise of fascism, rise of communism, and was swamped in an overwhelming burst of politics, of ideological politics, of, again, a very, very bad patch in European history. But again, coming out of that patch, we're now up to 1945, a renewed determination to try and inject a more civilized veneer into the way we conducted our international business. And the successor to the League of Nations, the UN, was created, centrally concerned with security, as I've just said. I've quoted the Charter to you. But also, again, with very considerable human rights add-on, bits of human rights machinery, and so on. And most conspicuously, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose main begetter actually was Eleanor Roosevelt, which set out, for the first time in human history, really, an attempted codification of the sorts of rights which we ought to be defending. Now, there's lots of argument about it. There's still lots of argument about it. A core argument is how peculiar are these rights to the Western view of the world, if I can put it that way? Are there differences in African rights and, I don't know, Australian rights and what have you? I have to say I don't have a lot of time for that argument. I think there are central functions of human dignity which are universal, which we all want to observe and maintain. And when I hear people criticizing this or that aspect of the Universal Declaration, I'm normally looking at a Mobutu or a Pinochet or someone who has very special reasons for not wanting to uphold this or that right. Anyway, codified in 1948 within the UN. Again, not the ideal time for the world to be trying to create universal human rights machinery, although it did create a bit of machinery in the UN. And that machinery, although very weak and still very much derided, because there are limits on how it could work, basically it's machinery that depends upon political assent to criticize and to sanction countries, so that a major human rights violator like Burma managed to get through relatively unscathed because of what you might call Southeast Asian solidarity. A major human rights breaker like North Korea gets through still, actually, because of Chinese support within the UN system. But nevertheless, it began to create a sort of global atmosphere of there's stuff here which, even if I'm a very nasty dictator, I don't want to find myself on the wrong side of. I need at least to be seen to be in accordance with this stuff as much as I can. And you find the beginning of at least verbal acquiescence in the standards and in the machinery that is beginning to emerge. But as I say, not the ideal time, because of course 1945, what we're getting into is the Cold War. And those political problems, the political divisions which make the enforcement of these values extremely difficult, are there in spades. You've got the communist world on the one hand, the Western world on the other hand, a lot of the rest of the world standing rather uneasily neutral, non-aligned as it was called, between the two. And you have a situation where it is extraordinarily difficult for people to take an objective view of the rights that they are defending and how they might best be defended. We in the West, because of our concerns about security, were very blind to a lot of major breakers of human rights. I've mentioned Pinochet, I've mentioned Mobutu, apartheid we tolerated for far too long in South Africa, and so on. And indeed, we also stood aside, and this was more defensible, against some major breaches of demands for more human rights in the eastern half of our continent. Here in this city in 1953, there were major demonstrations against the then communist regime, which were put down brutally, and the West did nothing. 1956, the same happened in Hungary. 1968, the same happened in Prague. And we made the judgment, and looking back, I suspect it was a correct judgment, that to go in support of, in obvious support of human rights in those circumstances, could easily have led to nuclear war. Coming back to a point I made earlier, would you rather be living in a radioactive wasteland or have your rights utterly, utterly defended? The answer, again, I think is clear. There have to be limits on how far you're willing to go in the human rights crusade. So we maintained a blind spot. The Russian, I mean, I have no time at all for communism. I spent far too long in the aftermath of it in Russia and in Eastern Europe. They, of course, had very little sympathy at all with human rights. Their view of the world was they knew the truth, which was communism. Their people were expected to at least pay lip service to the truth, and there was no question of not putting them in jail if they didn't. This consensus, however, began to break down in the 1970s, and it's quite interesting to ask ourselves why. What changed in the 1970s? And a couple of things changed. First of all, communism itself was becoming less repressive. Things were opening up there. There was some slight opportunity for dissent in the Soviet Union and in other Eastern European countries. And they were producing very prominent dissentients. The names Solzhenitsyn, of course, and Sakharov became very big and visible in the 1970s. Secondly, there was a big negotiating process going on here in Europe, which I played a little part in the end of, the so-called Helsinki process, which was actually all about settling the borders of Europe, which had not been finally agreed since 1945, and which the Russians wanted very badly to do. And some bright spark in some Western foreign ministry, and I've never been able to find out where, said, okay, they want this, what can we get in return? And the suggestion was, well, they're very bad at human rights. Nobody really believed in this, but this was an opportunity to embarrass the communists, to find ways of putting pressure on them. Let's add, it was called Basket 3, a little extra bit onto the Helsinki deal, which requires governments who sign up to it to observe fundamental human rights. Nobody believed it would work. Nobody believed that communism could coexist with it. But since they didn't believe it either, they signed up, and the documents were agreed and went into effect. And remarkably, the Helsinki basket had echoes in Eastern Europe. Eastern European peoples spotted that their governments had signed up to these things, and suddenly you got NGOs harassed, arrested, repressed, but nevertheless NGOs demanding the extension to Eastern Europe, to communist countries, which we have had already in Western Europe. And this was a huge part of what finally brought communism down, was this emergence of a domestic consciousness, very limited, as I say, repressed and sat upon, but this emergence of a domestic consciousness that they, in Russia and in Eastern Europe, were entitled to exactly the same rights as we in Western Europe already had. Played a huge part in the final destruction of communism. And President Carter, and because we in the West woke up to the fact that there's a real problem for them, of course we gave it as big a push as we could. President Carter in 1976 said, our commitment to human rights must be absolute. And over the succeeding, we're talking 1975 to 1989, I can't do the maths, but something like 24 years, 25 years, human rights at that point became central to the Cold War, and it was a trump card for the West, which, as I say, played a key role in finally bringing communism down. So there we are at the end of the Cold War. We've won. Suddenly, human rights are for everyone. It was the end of history, you'll remember. Francis Fukuyama declared it. A couple of days ago, I went through Checkpoint Charlie. And of course, when you go to Checkpoint Charlie, there's a big sign saying, you are now entering the American sector. And in a sense, the whole world became the American sector after 1989, 1990. We felt absolutely dominant. We were in control. Our values, we saw them as were historically inevitable, the right values. And for quite a long time, we were able to impose those values, in a sense. We went through a sequence of actions designed to push in a world which was already very, very ready for them. One of the aftermaths of 1989 was a very rapid spread of democracy. Whereas before that point, there had been 40 or 50 democracies in the world. After it, there were over 100. Democracy looked dominant. Human rights that came with it also looked dominant. As I say, there was a strong feeling around that this was the future for everyone, for all of mankind. And, okay, it was fine that it was emerging in an evolutionary way in lots of countries, but we in the West felt sufficiently confident, and Russia was sufficiently weak, China was still relatively poor, so there's nobody who was going to stand in our way, and felt free to push it by whatever means were needed. And we went through a succession, actually, of military interventions. In Somalia in 1991-92, in Iraq in 1991-92, in former Yugoslavia from 1991 to 1999, through a whole confusion of different actions, and indeed in Kosovo in particular in 1998, where we stepped in when faced with major breaches of human rights and stopped them, and took the necessary political action to enforce our view of how the world ought to function. And in the course of those years, we were also able to introduce into the international machinery a lot of new, as we saw it, good stuff intended to enforce these rights further. Again, this was sort of an accident, really. In the course of the Yugoslav wars and the carnage in Cambodia, we thought it would be nice if we can ever get this to end, to judge the people who've done the killing. So we created 2 international criminal tribunals for former Yugoslavia and for Cambodia, and unexpectedly again, they worked. Real criminals were brought to international justice and sent off to jail, a fair number of them. And inspired by this example, we went on, and I was directly involved in this, we thought, well, if we could do this for Yugoslavia and we can do this for Cambodia, then we can do it for the world as a whole. So we created the International Criminal Court, which I'm happy to come back to in questions if you like, but felt very good at the time. The idea being that so-called impunity, if you're a dictator, you kill a lot of your people, if you're a rebel and take child soldiers, if you encourage your troops to rape their victims, they are subject to international justice, even if the local justice system doesn't work. And this felt, the tide was with us. We were making the world a better, cleaner, a world much more attentive to the human rights as we saw them. And in a way, the high point was the so-called responsibility to protect, which was the product of a global summit in the UN in 2005, which set out a duty for leaders of countries not to massacre their people, putting it very crudely, and set out a duty for international society to make sure that such massacres did not take place. So the old UN principle of not interfering in the internal affairs of member states looked as if it was being replaced by a new principle of, as I say, duty to protect. A world where states did, again, interfere in each other's internal processes for good human rights processes. And I'm happy to say, again, it was a British moment. Tony Blair, in a famous speech in 1999, which was the beginning in particular of the movement to create the International Criminal Court and the responsibility to protect, announced a so-called doctrine of international community. We live in a global village. You can hear when your neighbor is beating his wife or is sending his children out to do drugs. And because we live in a global village, because the world is getting smaller, because we're all on each other's backyards, so we have a responsibility and a concern to make sure that the houses around us like ours are decently run and conducted. And that felt great, but already the challenges were emerging. There was a big massacre, a horrible massacre in Rwanda in 1994. And while the West felt able to intervene in Yugoslavia, which was very close, in Rwanda, which was a long way away, much poorer, much less politically significant in all sorts of ways, the West chose not to intervene. If we have real political interests, if this is next door, then you act, but if it's a long way away, then you're less ready to do so. The Anglo-American action in Iraq, of course, was immensely contentious at the time. One of its objectives, however, was to get rid of a nasty dictator, Saddam Hussein, was to replace him with a democracy, and as you all know, it went horribly, horribly wrong. What we produced was a civil war, appalling fighting between the Shia and the Sunni in Iraq, and actually produced ISIS, produced the major Islamic fundamentalist group, which we are now having such trouble dealing with. Our action in Libya, similarly. We learned from Iraq, which was a long-term process, that you put British troops in there, you put American troops in there, they get killed, your domestic political support for what you're doing diminishes. So we decided only to bomb in Libya, which we did. Again, it worked. Again, we got rid of a very nasty dictator, Gaddafi. But again, we left a horrible mess behind us, and a mess which has not yet been cleared up. And we have Syria. Now, we can have lots of arguments about Syria. I mean, the defensible line on Syria is we in the West have seen the damaging things you can do by intervening, like we did in Iraq and in Libya. But we can also see now the damaging consequences of not intervening, which is where we are now in Syria. I guess well, there are two conclusions. One is the Arab world, which I know quite well, is an extraordinarily difficult place for outsiders to operate successfully. The fissures and the tensions and the history go too deep for any ordinary outsider to be able to operate effectively. And the other lesson, I can't remember what the other lesson is now. Anyway, that goes there. But there is a question about external intervention in situations where you do not have the will and the capacity and the determination to see your intervention through to a successful conclusion. And after Iraq, we certainly didn't have that in Syria. Meanwhile, a rather more challenging phenomenon is emerging, which also raises questions about the sustainability of the international human rights regime going forward. As I said to you, we created at the beginnings of a regime after the Second World War, UN, the Universal Declaration, all of that stuff, and it didn't work for 30 years because we had the Cold War, because political tensions between the great powers swamped concern for individual human rights. And when we looked at, I don't know, Pinochet, we thought to ourselves, he's a very nasty man, but he's our man. So no, we're not going to do anything against him. I regret to say that to some extent, that situation, of course, is re-emerging. As we look at the rise of Russia again, as we look at the growing global significance of China, you are looking at two countries which do not share the Western view of human rights, which in some sense see it as a challenge to their own domestic cohesion and strength. Deng Xiaoping famously at one point referred to the Western concern for human rights as merely a mask for Western hegemonism, for the Western wish to interfere in Chinese governance. So you have two powers emerging who want none of this, who want to go back to the old system of power politics being what the international system is all about, and each country, at least in their spheres of influence, conducting itself with regard to its people in whatever way it chooses to do so. And as we have watched the world emerge and watched situations emerge just over the last couple of years, we have seen that there are genuine limits on our ability in the West to impose our view of human rights. Syria being the most conspicuous recent example, where the Russians, horrified by our total performance in the whole Middle East, have stepped in and basically excluded us and have been at the back or have permitted a lot of the very nasty stuff that's gone on there since. And one can imagine that happening again. And in other, not so much in Europe, I don't think, because the Russians, although people claim to the different, don't actually have any territorial claims in Europe. But one can imagine in the vicinity of China, if a country which is friendly to China engages in major breaches of human rights, our problem in intervening there will be impossibly huge. We won't be able to do it because the threat of getting into a major confrontation with China would be too great. So we've had our humanitarian moment. We got there, as I say, when we all entered the American sector in 1989. We did a lot of good things in the course of the subsequent, again, I can't do the maths, but it feels like 25 years, in the subsequent 25 years. But our capacity to do good things and the limits on our ability to do good things have become much more apparent. The Middle East is a terrible area to try and do this stuff in. As I've said, Russia and China have emerged as major challenges to the human rights moment. So I don't want to conclude on a deeply gloomy note. And I don't feel gloomy about it. There are reasons for gloom. People have talked about the world we're now entering as the world of a new Cold War. I hope they're wrong, but I'm not absolutely convinced that they're wrong. Certainly the holiday from history is over. Certainly the American sector that we thought we were all in has now become something much more ambiguous. And therefore our ability to believe that our writ will run has become much less persuasive. But that said, as I look back over the history actually going back to 1618, 1648, to my admittedly prejudiced eye, what you are looking at is a steady rise in concern for human rights, a steady improvement in the machinery we've got to promote it, a steady improvement in, a global commitment is too strong a phrase, but in the consciousness that there's something there that all human beings care about, and in the determination of at least a minority of countries, but significant proportions of populations even not in those countries, if you think back to the Helsinki process and the emergence of consciousness in Russia, that there is something there for them. And it was Victor Hugo who said, there is no force in history like that of an idea whose time has come. And while I wouldn't claim that the human rights time has absolutely come, I think it's very visibly coming. So I continue to work for it, and I'm sure we all will too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. You said at the beginning that a diplomat is someone who thinks twice before saying nothing. You said many things because you are not any longer government employee, so you could easily say it. I want to use my prerogative of holding the microphone and ask the first question to you before I turn to the audience. You said that in Somalia, in 1990, in Somalia, and then in the Balkans, the Western countries stepped in and stopped the violation of human rights. How do you compare this with the American and British interference in Iraq and what happened in Abu Ghraib prisons? And that of course, both United Kingdom and United States, I think, brought to justice, internal justice or administrative inquiries were made about the soldiers who caused these abuses of human rights. But unlike the other cases, there was no attempt to bring these people or the perpetrators to the international justice, I mean ICC or other mechanism, because it was different. This is one subject that you may wish to comment. Secondly, when I am asked to participate in the programs regarding the situation in Syria, I always, very frequently, I conclude with the following question. They say now that there is something like 170,000 people killed in Syria, Syrian crisis as a whole. Let's suppose that international community was not, my country, Turkey being the first one, was not to interfere in Syrian affairs and let Bashar Assad kill no matter how many people he was going to kill. Do you think that 170 people 7,000 people was going to be killed again, or would it be less? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, on Abu Ghraib, you're right, of course, there was no international system of justice, and that is because there was a United States investigation, and a number of people involved were arrested and were tried and were sent to prison. And I think it speaks well of the United States that they conducted that process. I can think of a few countries confronted with an Abu Ghraib type situation which would have swept it all under the carpet. There was no need for an international process, and indeed the International Criminal Court is designed specifically for circumstances where national justice can't operate, and it could operate in those cases. Now on Syria, I spent quite a lot of time on Syria in one way or another, and you ask an impossible question. Bashar al-Assad is without doubt a very nasty dictator and was running a very unpleasant system of government. He was, well, the size of the revolt against him at the time of the Arab Spring demonstrates how unpopular he was with at least a proportion of his population. But those of us who watched the Arab Spring and thought, great, this is it. This is democracy at last breaking out in the Arab world, have been deeply saddened by the aftermath in every country except rather small Tunisia. It has gone wrong again and again and again. In Egypt, in particular, in Syria we're already discussing, and in numerous other places. And if you look at why it's gone wrong because in particular of the deep fissure within Arab states between Shia and Sunni. And the situation as it has emerged is that if you free up the population of Syria, to take a particular example, what happens is, and it was also true in Iraq, of course, you free them up instead of, and I was heavily involved in doing Iraq. I did it out of the British Embassy in Washington, and I remember confidently expecting, we're going to go in there, get rid of Saddam Hussein, which is great, give him democracy, and go away feeling we'd done a good job. And we did the first two of those things. We went in there, we got rid of Saddam Hussein, we gave them democracy, and instead of using democracy to get on with getting rich and building a civilized society, they automatically turned to fighting each other. And exactly the same, even before Assad has gone, has happened in Syria. Now, I have no answer to this. Various people, Lee Kuan Yew, for example, would have said, well, people are bad. You know, sometimes they need strong government. And you can see the persuasiveness of that argument as applied to Syria, as it now is, as applied to Libya, God's sake, Gaddafi. But actually, if I were a Libyan, and I know a few Libyans, they say to me, it was better under Gaddafi than it is now. In former Yugoslavia, which was a communist regime, I have no time at all for communism. But the fact is that Tito kept the Croats and the Serbs and everyone else from each other's throats in a way that a much more democratic and attentive system has not. Now, that's a very gloomy prognosis. I suspect over time people will overcome their tribal differences and we'll get to a situation where they can then build a civilized society. But it is unrealistic to assert that that can happen everywhere tomorrow. There are cultural constraints there. We're in the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, which we have to recognize and go with the grain of.
Thank you very much. This was very clear. Now, you see how many comments and questions there will be. Shall we begin by ladies?
Thank you very much for this illuminating talk. There's a lot of information there and a lot to digest, but I was particularly curious to learn more about the role of the ICC. In modern days, we hear now in the media more and more countries are withdrawing their membership from ICC, and some of them are actually opting out and not to join in because of the fear of how much it will influence the justice system within their countries as well as other ramifications, if you will. I just wanted to hear what you thought about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, as I say, I was involved in creating the ICC. I was one of the optimists who helped design it. And we saw this as building on the experience of former Yugoslavia and of Cambodia as offering an international system of justice and protection of human rights. It has to be said that it did not start well. It was created and everybody lined up to, well, some people lined up to sign up for it, but the exceptions are very striking. The United States didn't, China didn't, India didn't. So already you've got a very large chunk of major global powers or potentially major global powers who are just excluding themselves from it. Moreover, there's a thing called Article 98 of the Icc Charter, under which countries can exclude from the ICC jurisdiction people of other nationalities. The United States didn't only exclude itself, it went around and twisted the arms of more than 100 countries to sign an Article 98 exclusion for US citizens. I mean, I argued about this with Americans for a long, long time, and their view is very clear. And their experience, has to be said, is different from our experience. We trust judges. We trust prosecutors. Americans, on the whole, don't. They view prosecutors and judges as politically oriented. They see themselves as living in a world where there's a lot of anti-Americanism. And their view was that if we submit ourselves to this court, there'll be people out there who will be going out of their way to arrest US Marines for doing their job in places like Lebanon and elsewhere. So that was a major weakness to start with. So the ICC started badly, and then it turned out there were a handful of things that it could get involved in, mostly African things, it has to be said, Liberia and places like that. And it did do a tolerably good job in dealing with some very nasty cases over there. But the reaction in Africa, in a lot of Africa, was, why is this international institution focusing on us? We're not the only human rights malefactors in the world. So you've now seen the beginning of what I fear might be quite a substantial wave of African withdrawals for the ICC. Now, I hope this isn't fatal. I hope that things will flatten out, that something will happen which will say to the Americans, we need to be part of this. Some very nasty action, e.g. by Russia, which they have no other way to deal with but through the ICC. Let me give you an example. Syria. Huge accusations at the moment of breaches of human rights, breaches of international law there. At least some of them are certainly valid. And the Americans are demanding, and we, the British, are demanding, these people need to be brought to trial who did these things. At the moment, there's no jurisdiction. This is happening in a country which is not a member of the ICC, Syria. It is being done by a country which is not another member of the ICC, Russia. And the only way of getting around those limitations on jurisdiction is by getting a Security Council resolution, which, of course, you won't get because Russia will veto it. So there are obstacles there, there are weaknesses there. I just hope that sooner or later a case will turn up, which will make the Russians say, we need to use the ICC, let's join up. And similarly, will make the Americans do so. But we're not there yet.
Yes, we will do gender equality. I think
thank you very much. I would like to talk about Iraq, which you mentioned. I was a huge enthusiast for the effort in 2003 to remove Saddam Hussein. But Iraq would have been a successful story had you really consulted with the Iraqi intellectuals, Iraqi academics. But you really went there and you had the wrong people there. Paul Bremer thought that his time in Malawi as ambassador to the United States was relevant to Iraq. And Greenstock, he was a great ambassador, but he was really agreeing with Bremer. I was there, I was in the governing council. So in the end, what you did was handing over power to militias, to Islamist fundamentalists, to people who were not really Democrats. So how can you really expect a democracy to develop when you don't have democratic forces there, when you did not consult any democratic forces, when you didn't even know how Iraqi society worked and how people behaved? I expected what happened to happen because I knew we were going in the wrong direction. We told the Americans, we told the British, but they didn't listen. They were just, I don't know, some people in Iraq now feel it was planned. It was all a conspiracy. It was planned. They didn't really want a democracy in Iraq. So what's needed with regard to the Middle East as a whole? You need to consult with intellectuals, with sociologists, with academics. These people may have answers, but to just deal with militias and the warlords, I think it's not a good idea. Thank you.
Well, I'm certainly not going to claim that everything went right in Iraq. I think you probably overstate the value of academics. All the academics in the UK were telling us how we were going to remain in the EU. And that didn't quite work out that way. And you're right that we got it completely wrong. But we certainly set up democratic systems in Iraq. And it was and there were elections. And it was within the context of those systems. Well, yeah, but these were free-ish elections, to the extent that free-ish elections are possible in Iraq. And you're right, it wasn't only a certain segment of Iraqis who we didn't consult. Those who were doing it didn't take a lot of notice of their own Arab experts at home, because people in the Foreign Office and in the State Department were saying, this is going to be a disaster, because the Shia, you take over from Saddam, you install what is bound to be a Shia-dominated administration, and the Sunni just won't have it. And they were quite right. There were huge misjudgments there, which I freely acknowledge. But we did, to repeat what we thought we were doing, we set up a democratic system, there were elections, and we thought, that's great, we can go now. And we were wrong. Please.
I have a question about that's based on your presentation. It was a tour through history that seemed to suggest progress, but also it could possibly be a pendulum that's about to swing the other way. And you mentioned power politics coming into being. If you have Russia, you said they didn't have territorial aspirations, but I think Ukraine would disagree with that idea. You have President Xi expanding Chinese territory, and you have an American president who is bound, determined to swagger his way through history to exert American power. What's going to happen to human rights? We have a big power politics situation shaping up. Is there any connection?
Yeah, no. I mean, first of all, I don't accept the pendulum view of history. I mean, the world has changed quite profoundly. We have much more science, much more technology, much closer communication, much bigger trade links. People travel a lot. The feeling that the human race is one isn't there yet, but it's an emerging feeling. And that means we're living in a profoundly different world from the worlds of 1914 or 1945. And that's an important background consideration. Now, nor did I claim that progress was always upwards. What it is more a step, really. Things step back and then go up again. But I think if you compare the human race in terms of its life expectancy, in terms of its quality of life, in terms of the freedoms that a huge number of human beings enjoy, with, again, if you go back to 1945 or 1914, we've massively moved forward. Now, I'm not claiming that over the next 4 years, which, as you say, do look pretty problematical, things are necessarily going to move forward as we would like. I mean, the country I know best, other than my own, which is Russia, there are real problems with Russia. They don't have territorial claims in Ukraine. They've taken Crimea. They were offered a large chunk of eastern Ukraine through a referendum and didn't take it. There's a huge myth about Russia, that revanchist Russia. They're actually very weak and very scared, which is why they're behaving the way they are. But ordinary Russians, as I talk to them, as I go around the country, they know us. They don't much like the West. They view us as predatory and challenging, and all the stuff that's happened since Ukraine has compounded their feeling that we're somehow hostile to them. But behind that, there is a feeling that we have a right to have a say in our own government. And that feeling, amplified by the internet, which is actually rather free in Russia still, by freedom of travel, which they've still got, is gradually seeping into the society. There was a major effort, of course, in 2011, 2012, big demonstrations, to overthrow Putin is putting it too strongly, but to carry Russia forward a notch on democracy. It failed, but the energy that went into that movement demonstrates that the hunger is there. And I'm confident, someone knowing Russia, that sooner or later it's going to come back.
Two short questions. One part of your speech, you mentioned, and you always talk about, refer to we in Yugoslavia, we in Iraq. Definitely, we doesn't mean 25 German tanks in Yugoslavia. It means the Americans.
were
And
in
the
Yugoslavia
British.
too.
Yes, I agree, and the British. Same goes for Iraq. I remember maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I don't really know, there was this big discussion about the 60,000 special armies trained soldiers from the European Union being trained for special occasions like this. Now, that whole thing fell asleep because of peace-ridden people in Europe who couldn't care less, most probably. I mean, the Pacha flag was the big thing and everything else, I guess. For me, it was definite that this is not going to work. Up to this day, we don't have this army. That's the first thing. Second, Putin. You know, Putin is a great skier. He loves skiing. He speaks German quite well. And a good friend of mine is a big ski star in Austria, where Putin resides almost every year for about 10 days, 12 days to ski on the Arlberg. And this guy is a friend of mine. And I talked to him once and I said, tell me, just from sitting there in the evening with him and talking to him and going skiing with him, is he a different person than all the other leaders in Russia were before that? So my question now, on a scale from 1 to 10, what's the difference between Putin? I know that's a simple way of putting it, but what's the difference between somebody like Putin in our times and, yeah, some of the other ones beforehand?
Sorry,
Thank you.
I got so fascinated with your second question that I've forgotten what the first one was.
Well, on a scale from 1 to 10.
No, but before the scale to 1
well,
to 10.
the 60,000
Oh, the 60,000,
special
the European
trained
army, European
soldiers
army.
to deal with
Yeah,
these
the European
problems.
army. Okay.
You know,
On the
that-
European army, and I speak as someone from a country which is now on the way out of the European Union, I've never believed in it, and I don't believe in it. To run an army, to use an army effectively, you need a speed and decisiveness of political operation, which the European Union very visibly doesn't have. You could no doubt create it, and lots of countries would pile in enthusiastically and earmark troops for it, although they wouldn't actually put very much in there. But the moment you came to try and use it, there'd be disagreements. The Belgians would say, we can't go in there because we sell them something. I apologise to any Belgians in the audience. That's just an exemplary, just an example. Austrians the same, exactly. It would be quite impossible. I'm not very sympathetic to transnational government of any sort, but the idea of the European Union running an army seems to be being useless and scary, actually. Now, and it's not going to happen, at least not in the immediate future. Putin, I know Putin quite well as well. I was British ambassador for a while when he was president. Now, I don't know how your friend responded to your question. Rather than responding on your scale from 1 to 10, let me just describe the Putin that I know. He's got this ludicrous image in the West now, a man who's out to take over the world, and every word he says is a lie and all of that. That is all nonsense. He is a man, he's very careful, he is very bright, he is very focused, and what he's focused on is getting, and this is his word, respect back for Russia. His view is that we in the West have not given his country, great country in his view, great country by anybody's view, the respect that it has deserved. And he's determined to get that respect back. He is utterly unscrupulous and ruthless about how he will go about doing that. He is the second best head of government I have ever met, best briefed head of government I have ever met, the best having been Margaret Thatcher. He knows everything. He knows more on the whole than the person he's talking to about whatever subject it is he's talking about. But he's not a madman. He's not a Hitler. He knows that the Soviet Union is dead. His concern is with Russia, and his concern, as I say, is to regain respect for Russia by whatever means he can achieve. He's also scared. These are figures which you don't see much in the Western press, but the West, NATO actually, spends 10 times as much on defense as Russia does. NATO's economy, taken together, is 20 times the size of the economy of Russia. NATO's population is 6 times the population of Russia. Russia knows they are dwarfed and overshadowed by the big neighbor next door, and they fear it. They see us as trying to encircle them, which is why they have reacted as they did in Ukraine and also in Georgia. So coming back to President Trump, with whom we can all disagree radically on lots of things, but I believe that one thing that he has got right is the need to re-establish a sensible basis for relations with Russia. I don't know how many of you noticed this, but back at the end of September this year, there was a major, major confrontation with US generals saying to the US Congress, okay, we can impose a no-fly zone in Syria, but we'll have to go to war with Russia to do it. And Russian generals in Syria saying if a US plane comes over us, we're going to shoot it down. With the Russians putting out for display to US satellites in Kaliningrad, a northern province of Russia, so-called Iskander missiles, the point about them being that they could carry nuclear warheads if necessary. Lots of rhetoric, lots of challenge. We have, since Ukraine, relations have degenerated steadily to an extraordinarily dangerous condition now. And it seems to me to be a number one task of whoever becomes President of the United States to begin to reintroduce a bit more sense and stability into the relationship. So, as I say, we can argue a lot about Trump, but on that, he's right.
I won't go into the statistics. I won't go into the statistics of the human carnage and also the usurpation of human rights in Syria. I'm leaving that aside. But the world is sitting there impotent to be able to do anything as has been going on for 5 years. So, is the problem that there are too many players in Syria, or is that the problem that the balance of power is shifting?
Well, both really. The fact that Russia is there makes it much more difficult for the West to intervene because there's the threat of a confrontation with Russia. I'll tell you a story. At the beginning of the Georgia war, the Russians were sending in the Georgians started the war, I should say, but having started it, the Russians were sending in troops to deal with the Georgians. And there was a meeting of the National Security Council in Washington, chaired by a friend of mine, Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor at the time. And there were lots of generals beating their chests and saying, we can sort the Ruskies out. You know, we can bomb. The Rocky Tunnel was a little tunnel that all the Russian things were coming through. So we can deal with them. And Steve Hadley, calmly and quietly, in the way that he has, said, are we willing to go to war with Russia over Georgia? Whereupon silence fell. And I'm afraid we're in exactly the same situation with regard to Syria. Bad though things are in Syria, the question of going to war with Russia over it is simply not on the table. And as I look at it, I mean, the other perspective to take on this is I look at it from the British point of view, the British government's point of view, the decision it has to make. As I've said, the only Western interventions in the Middle East, and barely then, that have succeeded, have involved ground troops and have involved being ready to stay there for as long as it takes for the situation to come right, which is a situation we've just about now reached in Iraq. But it's taken 13 years. Now, you ask a British minister, is he prepared to put a lot of British soldiers on the ground in Damascus and Aleppo, where jihadis will be taking pot shots at them around every dark corner for an indeterminate future? And he'll say, I've got an election to win. There's no way I'm going to do that. So those are the reasons why the West has held back. I have to go very shortly. I think we're allowed one more question, are we?
Yeah.
Please, yes.
Yeah, my question, I am baffled and so disturbed, more especially about the African leaders. Here, in as much as we want corruptions to be fight, or we want sit-tight syndrome leaders should be, tried by the ICC, I also want to believe that if you're a leader, you have to lead by example. The Americans refused to domesticate the ICC issue. Now, Americans are the same people propagating for human rights. They are the same encouraging the ICC to try African leaders. Why do they refuse to domesticate that article?
No, you're right, it's a fair question. There's a better way of asking the question, if I may, which is the row that's going on at the moment between China and some surrounding countries about Chinese claim in the South China Sea, which they've just had a tribunal judgment on under the UN Law of the Sea Convention, and China is under pressure to observe that judgment, and one of the key people applying that pressure is the United States, which is not a signatory of the UN Law of the Sea Convention. So the Chinese naturally saying, this is arrogant. How can you pressurize us on the basis of an agreement which you haven't signed? The ICC, I think, is slightly different because America is not a signatory. And while America has backed the rise of democracy in Africa, which actually has gone reasonably successfully over the last few years, there are, as you say, stay-in-place autocrats still, but quite a lot of African states have turned democratic, and one hopes sustainably democratic over time. And the Americans have been in the lead in offering money, in offering support, in offering civil society engagement, and so on, which is very good. What the Americans have not done is pressed the use of the ICC because they're not members of it. So I think we have to be fair to the Americans. There are problems with America, and we're in an interesting moment, really, because up until now, America has viewed itself as the exceptional nation. They are the tent pole on which the whole of the international system has depended. And they've actually done a pretty good job. They won the Cold War. They've seen us through the holiday from history. But now there are challenges to the stability and centrality of the tent pole. Now, as you say, we can criticize them. They do things wrong. Let's pressurize them to do things differently. But if, and this is a worry about Trump, actually, if they say, okay, we've had enough of this, we've had enough of being the global sheriff, we're going to withdraw and simply focus on US interests, and the rest of you can sort yourselves out if you like, I think we might rather rapidly regret their absence. Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Brenton, you may have noticed how thought-provoking was your
At least I woke you all up.
presentation. And thank you very much. Please join me to congratulate once more Mr. Ambassador for this.